Until now, we've been talking about the past, which is pretty comfortable ground for a historian. And we've been talking more recently about the present, or at least working our way up to the present, which again, at least it's stuff we can see in front of us. We don't know quite what to make of it always, but there it is. But now we come to the diciest business of all, and that is to try to figure out what the future is going to bring. Now, the first thing that I have to say is that historians have no crystal ball, and we have no particular advantage over anybody else in figuring out precisely what the future is going to bring. So I got to get that disclaimer out of the way. However, I will say this, that historians do have a certain advantage in, well, I won't say we've seen it all before, but we've seen a lot before. And it's the very unusual future that is nothing like the past. So the historian can say, all right, the future is probably going to look sort of like this within some range, because the past doesn't change that much, hasn't changed that much, and we can say, well, okay, it might go this way, it might go that way, but it's probably not going to go and do something that has never happened before. Now, I have to say this with sort of a statistical estimate. Yeah, there are those things that have never happened, at least never in, let's say, human history. The Earth could be hit by a comet or an asteroid, and we could all be destroyed. And that would be the end of it. That's not in the realm of prediction. So we'll leave those things aside. I'm going to rule out, at least as a real long shot, a nuclear war that destroys civilization. It's not out of the question that one or more of the several nuclear powers in the world could use nuclear weapons in the future. They haven't. Nobody has used them in war, except, of course, the United States. And if there is indeed another world war, then all right, so maybe there'd be a nuclear war. But let's look first at the next 10 years. So we're going to talk about here, I'm going to try to make some guesses. I'm going to give some guidelines for thinking about what the world is going to look like 10 years from now. Now, I put this to you, my students, because the great majority of you are still going to be alive, around, involved in 10 years. And so, and this, by the way, is kind of in that tricky realm of prediction where, if I want to predict what's going to happen tomorrow, then I say it's going to be pretty much like today, plus or minus 2 or 3%. But the problem with that is that a certain problem with that is that you're going to be around tomorrow and you'll be able to call me on it. Okay, you did it or not. So meteorologists who predict the weather, they say, okay, there's going to be an 80% chance of rain tomorrow. And the tomorrow comes and it doesn't rain, it's bright and sunny, and people say, you got it wrong. So this sort of thing happens. If I predict something 10 years down the road, well, I'm probably safe, because unless you are writing all this down, or who knows if YouTube will still be in existence 10 years from now, you'll probably have forgotten anything that I said, so you won't be around to check me on it. And if we get even farther into the future, well, that's another thing entirely. So anyway, let's look at 10 years into the future. The first thing I'm going to say is that there's a general rule of thumb in the predicting or forecasting world. And I'm not going to make a big distinction between predicting and forecasting, but in trying to guess what's going to happen. And a general rule is that the near future looks very much like today. And as I said, tomorrow is going to look like today, probably plus or minus 0.5%. There are occasional days where big things happen, but for the most part, it's pretty much like today. But the farther out you get, then the larger the percentage of variation. So 10 years from now is going to look pretty much like today, maybe plus or minus 20%, maybe 20%. So what can we say about this? We're talking about American foreign policy. This is the focus of the course. So what is American foreign policy going to look like 10 years from now? Well, the first thing to ask is, what is the United States going to look like 10 years from now? And it's probably fair to say that the United States 10 years from now is going to look a lot like the United States today. It's going to have a somewhat larger population than it has today, so maybe 10 years from now it'll be 350 million people. Its GDP almost certainly will be larger than it is today, but not enormously larger. The growth rate of the United States economy has been between 2 and 4% for most of the last 20 or 30 years, and it's probably going to stay in that range. Now, one thing I have to allow for is the possibility that the pandemic we're in at the moment is not the last of the pandemics. If there is another pandemic 2 or 3 years from now, then I think a lot of things will change. So I'm going to condition my predictions on there not being another pandemic like the one of 2020 continuing to 2021. Because if there is, then a lot of things will change. And the reason that I say that I'm not going to guess it is because, well, I don't think there will be. The one like we've had, is the first one ever in human history to hit the whole planet pretty much simultaneously. Now, it's quite possible that the next pandemic will be like this. But on the other hand, we've been in a situation where a pandemic like this, a pandemic could have had this kind of global effect probably for the last 30, 40 years, and we haven't had anything like it. But if there is another pandemic, then people will start to factor this into this is the new normal and we have to plan for it. If there's not another pandemic, then I think that the effect of this pandemic will be like the effect of 9/11, the terrorist attacks on the United States in the year 2001, where it really changed the way Americans behaved and thought for a couple of years afterwards. So big financial firms, other businesses cleared out of the Wall Street district in New York. They just didn't want to be anywhere near that because they were afraid there was going to be another one. Well, there hasn't been another one, and the big firms moved back, and business, went back to normal. So things will get back to normal, assuming there's not another pandemic. If there is, then we'll reconsider that, but we'll call that a special case. So the United States economy is going to be the first or second largest economy in the world in 10 years. China is possibly, quite likely actually, going to have a larger economy than the United States in 10 years. Some of that has to do with how you measure it. Do you measure it per capita? Is that important in considering the military throw weight of a country? It matters, but it doesn't matter that much. It's really the gross size of the economy, the GDP, that matters, because even if Americans are still richer per person than Chinese, say, in 10 years, the government of China can basically call on the total GDP and take a big slice of that to build a large military establishment or do whatever it wants to do in foreign affairs. And you've heard me say that sooner or later countries get the foreign policies they can afford. So it's fair to say, I think it's a reasonable estimate, that China's foreign policy will continue to become more assertive, maybe even aggressive. This is what happens when countries get richer. We've seen this in the last 6 or 8, 10 years with China leading up to 2020, and there's absolutely no reason to think this trend will not continue through the 2020s, aiming for 2030. Now, what will this mean for the United States? The United States Americans are going to have to get used to the idea that the United States is no longer the global hegemon. Now, in fact, the United States hasn't been a real, an honest-to-goodness hegemon for a while. The United States discovered that it could not defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan. Taliban, this is a fairly ragtag group of people in a small country far away, and the American armed forces couldn't defeat the Taliban. Now, it looks like the war in Afghanistan is winding down. Conceivably, the war in Afghanistan will still be going on 10 years from now, but it's unlikely at this point that the United States is going to defeat the Taliban. I suspect that the United States will pull out, the Taliban will take over, and Afghanistan will have to figure out how to handle its own affairs that way. So, the United States is still going to have this big military establishment, but China will almost certainly have a big military establishment too. This is what countries that are rising in economic wealth do. They develop big military establishments and they start to throw their weight around. Will China be number one in the way the United States was number one from 1945, let's say, to 2000? No. Not as long as there is a United States. Now, part of the answer to this question has to do with what will Americans want of their country? What will they demand of their country? Will Americans still be beguiled by the thought the United States has to be number one? If they do, then they will continue to vote for big defense budgets, but there will come a time, I think, when Americans will have to choose, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But as China rises, China is going to become more challenging to the status quo that the United States established in East Asia, start coming out of World War II. So, for example, the United States declared what amounted to a protectorate over Taiwan. Taiwan has a security agreement with the United States. The Chinese government claims authority over Taiwan, and this has been a long-standing point of friction between the United States and China, and it's going to get worse because as China gets more powerful, the Chinese government is going to feel more and more tempted to try to put into effect its claim to control Taiwan. Will the United States come to the defense of Taiwan if China really does put the military screws to Taiwan? This is something nobody knows right now. It will depend a lot on who the President of the United States is. And here I'm going to hark back to a period in American history, strictly American history, where the South, several states, 11 states of the South, seceded from the United States in 1860 and 1861. And most of them did so, most of the Southerners who voted for secession did so in the belief that the North would not fight to keep them in the Union, or if the North did fight to keep them in the Union, the North would not fight very effectively. And so they basically were voting for independence and they were going to be out and they thought they would get it. Now they misunderstood Abraham Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln made this decision that no, I'm not going to let the South go without a fight. If Lincoln had a different opinion, if he had said, you know, I don't think secession is right, I don't think it's constitutional, but I don't think it's worth a war either, then Southern secession would have been successful. So, depending on who the President of the United States is, let's say the Chinese put the squeeze on the United States sometime in the next, on Taiwan sometime in the next 10 years. Well, they're certainly going to try to gauge the reaction of the President of the United States. They would much prefer that the United States not come to the aid of Taiwan because then it would be relatively straightforward. Taiwan probably could not defend itself. It might make it difficult for China to take over effectively. They might put up something of a fight, but if they saw that the U.S. wasn't coming to their aid, then they would probably have to cut whatever deal they could with China. And it might be a deal like the Chinese struck with Hong Kong, where Hong Kong was supposed to have this different regime for 50 years after the reversion from British control in the 1990s. Now, the government of China has pretty much torn that to ribbons and reneged on it 20 years into the 50-year transition period. But the government of Taiwan might feel that, okay, it could get this face-saving kind of arrangement and hope for the best as things proceed. But if the President of the United States was determined to back up Taiwan, then that would be a different calculus. And presumably, as China escalated, the American president would indicate, sorry, we're not going to let you do this. This isn't going to happen without a fight. And then the Chinese might decide, well, we're not going to do it now. They would look at what they saw, the relative trajectories of the United States and China. They would probably conclude that China was getting stronger. The United States was not getting much stronger. Maybe it was even weakening comparatively. So we might as well wait a little bit longer. No point in starting a huge war for something that we don't have to fight a war for, that Taiwan will fall into China's lap at some point in the not too distant future. So that's a possibility with China. Maybe a bigger deal, maybe not a bigger deal, but maybe a bigger deal is the American relationship with Japan. The United States has always had Japan's back since World War II, to the point where the United States has pledged to defend Japan against China and anybody else who might attack Japan, but China's the one, and to do so with nuclear weapons if necessary. And for this reason, Japan never developed much of a defense force. They have something they call a self-defense force, but they don't have a big army, they don't have a big navy like they had before and during World War II. And it was much to America's satisfaction and pleasure that the Japanese did not develop this because Americans didn't want to go to war against Japan again. So, but if the Japanese concluded that the United States was not going to fulfill its commitment, then the Japanese, they have the technology. They could build nuclear weapons almost overnight, and they would start to build up their navy and their army, and presumably then there might be a war at some point between Japan and China. And if there was a war between Japan and China, the United States would feel really tempted to get involved, because the United States would not want China to defeat Japan and sort of bring Japan into a greater China. I mean, that in reverse is what the United States went to war against Japan in the Second World War about. The Japanese were trying to bring China into a sphere. And it was the American position in those days, and to some extent it would be the American position today, that it's not good for the United States if one country dominates all of East Asia. So these are considerations. But in terms of sort of what else is going on in the world, other countries that, or groups of countries the United States might have to take an interest in. Well, one big question mark is the European Union. So the European Union, this group of European states, has grown in size from the original 5 and then 6, and then it got bigger and bigger. It is, as of late 2020, it's in the process of losing one of its principal members since the 1970s, and that is Britain. But does the EU continue to peel off members? It looked as though that might happen 6 or 7 years ago, when there was a financial crisis and the Germans really got upset with having to basically bail out the Italians and the Spanish and so on. But that aspect of it seems to have calmed down. And if anything, Britain's decision to leave, Brexit, has caused the other members of the EU to hold together. Now, if the EU continues to become more unified and more coherent, it would become sort of a superpower of Europe. Its GDP, its collective GDP, is about as big as that of the United States and roughly the same size as China. So there could be 3 big countries. And the question is, would they act together? And would the Europeans, would they form, would we have a world where there's one great power in the Americas, the United States, one great power in Asia, China, and one great power in Europe, the EU? So that's a possibility. Now, another possibility is that the strains in the EU would continue and the EU could fall apart. And so it would turn out to be this thing that seemed like a good idea in the late 20th century, but began gradually to lose its hold in the early 21st century, and by 2030 it's just a dead letter. There have been alliances, there have been groupings of countries that sort of fit that pattern. Related to that is an alliance that the United States is a member of that could very easily fall into that category, and that is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which seemed to make necessary sense in the 1940s. It was an alliance to prevent the Soviet Union from engaging in aggression against Western Europe. And as long as there was a Soviet Union, as long as there was a Cold War, it seemed like NATO was necessary. After the Cold War, NATO kind of lost its way, and it was looking around, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And nobody quite wanted to give up on it because it had served a very useful purpose during the Cold War. And it had been a way of keeping the United States interested in Europe. There was an old saying about the point of NATO after World War II, and regarding the European countries in America. The point of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. This was when Germany was disunited, when Germany was fragmented in 2 pieces. The Germans reunited in 1990, and so that part of it isn't there, but it serves the interest, it seems to many Europeans, to keep the United States involved in the affairs of Europe. Because otherwise, when countries aren't engaged in cooperation, they tend to drift into competition. Europe doesn't want to compete with the United States, and vice versa. But, NATO was originally targeted against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union disintegrated. Russia's another question. What's Russia going to be doing in the next 10 years? Is Russia going to be reclaiming something like the superpower status that it had in the Cold War? Probably not, because its economy is not very big. It's not growing very fast, if at all. Its population, in fact, seems to be declining. And so Russia is a wild card that can probably cause trouble, but I don't think it's going to cause the United States or the countries of Europe to really lie awake nights much. However, you've got to keep in mind that the Soviet Union has a nuclear arsenal. It's got thousands of nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons can really, mess up your day. And so you have to be aware of that, and you have to factor it in to your consideration. So what else in foreign policy? Well, so the biggest question for Americans has to do with, and I mentioned this earlier, but has to do with how much of America's GDP are Americans willing to devote to foreign policy? How do Americans view themselves and their country? Do they think that the United States should maintain the global leadership position that American presidents, starting with Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower and so on, claimed for the United States in the years after World War II? The position of Americans then, of American leaders, American presidents, but the American people bought into it, was that the United States needs to take a leadership position in the world to prevent a World War III. The United States had been slow to get in World War I and slow to get in World War II, and Americans thought, you know, we can't do this a third time because a third war would be even worse now that the world has nuclear weapons. And so the United States needs to get out front of this. And it needs to it needs to kind of guide the world. It needs to encourage cooperation among other countries of the world. It needs to reorder the world economy. This is a critical point. The world economy of the 1920s, and especially the 1930s, was a very competitive, but especially zero-sum system. Economies are not supposed to be zero-sum games. When you make a deal with somebody, you buy something for this amount of price. You both come out ahead because you think the thing that you're buying is worth more than the $20 you paid for it. And the person who's selling it to you decides that for him or her, the $20 is worth more than the thing is. And this is the essence of voluntary transactions. But in the 1930s, when the United States led the way in raising tariff barriers to imports, then there did become this zero-sum game where there was this thinking that if I import something from you, that costs jobs in my country, and so I'm going to stop that. Well, then the other side said, other countries said, well, wait a minute, we're going to let you do that, so we're going to block imports from your country. And so world trade just collapsed in the 1930s. And furthermore, it set up this style of thinking that said that foreign countries are not our customers, they're not our partners, they are our rivals, they are our enemies. From a trade war to a world war was a relatively straightforward step. So Americans adopted the position that we're going to try to engage the world in trade. We're going to aim for free trade, not tariffs, not tariff wars, not tariff barriers. If we can make each other our best customers, our best suppliers, then that will be the best guarantee that there won't be a World War III. And that idea pretty much reigned in the world economy until the beginning of the 21st century. There were strains on it. So China, as China industrialized and developed the capacity to produce consumer goods really cheaply, then Chinese goods flooded into other markets. The Chinese manufacturers in the United States and other advanced countries found that it was more expensive to produce stuff in their own countries than it was to produce it in China and import it from China. And so the Chinese seemed to be taking advantage of this system. And there was a political backlash in countries like the United States, culminating, at least for the time being, in the presidency of Donald Trump, who relaunched trade wars. He said, you know, he adopted a nationalist position on trade, contradictory to the internationalist position of every president from Franklin Roosevelt through Barack Obama. Now, it's important to keep in mind that President Trump was not the cause of the stuff that happened during his presidency. He was as much a symptom of this stuff as he was a cause. Americans, very many Americans, had already soured on the idea of globalism. And so when he came along and he said, okay, we're going to crack down on the Chinese and we're going to make America great again by bringing jobs back home, reindustrializing America, it resonated with a lot of people. It turned out to be harder to do than to promise, but still, it indicated that there was this widespread dissatisfaction with the role of the United States. When President Trump started to berate America's NATO allies for not paying their fair share, this was a complaint that Americans had had for decades, except that American presidents and secretaries of state and top diplomats understood that even if the United States paid more than its per capita share, the United States was actually the big winner in this deal, because as the top dog in the international status quo, the United States had the most to lose in case the international system broke down. So if you've got the most to lose, you're willing to pay more than other countries. President Trump challenged this and said, no, if the other countries don't pay up, then the United States isn't going to come to their aid again. And it really shook the basis of the NATO alliance and the whole system of international security that the United States has established, which was all based on confidence in America's commitment. If the United States says it's going to come to your defense, then you can count on that and you can act accordingly. But if it looked like the United States was not going to come to the defense of, let's say, Taiwan, I talked about that, or Japan, or Germany, or whatever the country might be, then those countries, they have to look out for themselves. And they start to think, well, maybe instead of opposing China's policies, we need to accommodate to China's policies. And a lot of this will depend in the next 10 years on the position that Americans take. So if Americans say, we like the changes that President Trump made in American foreign policy, and will vote for another candidate, conceivably Donald Trump again in 2024, then that change was going to be made. So if the United States says collectively, we are no longer going to lead the international system in the way that we have since 1945, then either there wouldn't be any leadership, there would be a kind of anarchy in the international system, or somebody else would step in and take over that leadership position. And well, one likely candidate would be China. Now, China's leadership would be a little bit problematic because China has and will have economic influence, and it probably will have more military influence than it did. But China's value system doesn't export very well because the Chinese system is kind of a market economy, but a mixed market and state-run economy. But at the same time, it's one-party rule by the Communist Party. And this isn't something that countries of Europe like. One of the things that made American leadership acceptable to other countries was the fact that the values that the United States represented were broadly appealing around the world. Now, another thing that happened during the Trump presidency was that the United States began backing away from endorsing those values, and sometimes, in fact, even tolerating, if not applauding, authoritarian regimes in other countries, and not standing up for democracy, not standing up for human rights. Now, it may very well be that the American people collectively have said and will say during the 2020s that that's not something that we want to go out on a limb for. And if the Chinese government beats up on the Uyghurs, then that's their problem, that's not our problem. Now, this was the attitude that the United States took during the 1930s. It was the era of isolationism. It would probably be a stretch to say that the United States is going to become isolationist during the 2020s, but something in that direction is certainly not out of the question. Okay, a few other things to consider. Global issues. So, climate change is the big one. And climate change is almost certainly going to continue. It's hard to believe that it's going to slow down much in 10 years. There's so much carbon dioxide that has already been emitted into the atmosphere that's not going away. It takes a while for the carbon dioxide to break down. And so, at best, climate change can be slowed in 10 years, but probably hardly even that. And there's a fundamental problem with addressing climate change, and that is the free rider problem. So, the United States and a few other countries could really get on board with reducing CO2 emissions. But if other countries didn't, well, they would still benefit from the reduction of CO2. And so it's tempting for every country, even down to the individual level, to say, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to count on other people making the necessary changes. So this is a tough one. And to really make something happen and stick, it's going to require international cooperation. In 2020, international cooperation is really hard to come by. But it may be that the climate change issue becomes so pressing and so obvious by 2030 that the nations of the world will really get together and do something to address the issue. But even if they do, its effect is going to take decades to set in. So this is one of those big intractable problems. But it may be that we live in an age of globalization whether we like it or not. So the pandemic of 2020 is a really good example of this, that whether countries were engaged in trade wars or not, people did cross borders, and they carried the virus with them. And so it spread from China and got all the way around the world within just a few months. That part's not going away. People are still going to travel. They are traveling less in the pandemic than they were before, but that's going to revive. And so it may be that global issues become more obvious and more unavoidable by 2030. So if so, then the world's going to have to figure out what to do with them. So that's some of what we could say about American foreign policy 10 years from now. Next go round, I'm going to take a bigger leap to 50 years from now.